Our NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli, who's traveling with President Biden while he is on his holiday break in the U.S. Virgin Islands. And Mem, this is just the beginning of what will be extensive coverage, of course, of the life of Jimmy Carter, of the state funeral, the services, both in Washington as well as in Georgia. And it is all but certain that President Biden will play a role in that.
That's right, Hallie. The President's Club is an exclusive one. Only 45 men have ever served as the President of the United States. And so it will fall to the 46th President of the United States, Joe Biden, to lead the country in mourning now for the 39th President. And we have already heard President Biden say publicly in the past that he will deliver one of the eulogies for Carter. And it's appropriate that he would do so, Hallie. This is somebody who, during the breadth of President Biden's long tenure in Washington, he was a young senator just in his early 30s when he was the first senator, the first person, in fact, outside the state of Georgia to endorse then former Governor Carter as he launched his bid for the presidency in 1976. That was the beginning of what remained a very strong relationship between these two men over the decades. And we remember the way that President Biden, in the early months of his presidency, took the trip to Georgia, showed the respect to one of his fellow presidents to visit with both President and Rosalind Carter at their residence in Plains, Georgia, spending the better part of an hour there. He last saw President Carter just a year ago when he traveled again to Georgia to join in the mourning for Rosalind Carter, attending her funeral service. And at the time, President Biden did say that they were able to spend a little bit of a time together, and he was able to tell President Carter how much he loved him. And so, as you think now, as President Biden is just himself preparing to leave office, himself a member of the one-term President's Club, the kinship between these two men, I think, will be on display for the country. And there will be certainly, I think, parallels drawn between their time in office, both their work on the foreign policy stage to achieve peace in the Middle East, their work in the closing days as President Biden is trying to achieve a hostage deal himself here for those Americans still in Gaza and Israel, and the ways in which the economic troubles of the country and inflation were part of their political undoing, but the ways in which they ran for office at a searing moment in the history of this country. Carter in the wake of Watergate, President Biden in the wake of impeachments of former president, now soon to be president again, Donald Trump. These are all sort of front of mind as the president will be doing that, leading the country in mourning. I should tell you, Hallie, we have not received yet any word from White House officials about whether we might hear directly from President Biden tonight. You know that there's always the capability for the pool to be summoned, for that to happen, even when he is on vacation. So certainly we'll be keeping you apprised of any change in that. But I would certainly expect to hear at least some form from President Biden, if not in person, but through a paper statement in the evening.
Mike Memoli live for us there at the Virgin Islands. Mike, thank you very much. John Meacham is back with us as well, the distinguished professor of history at Vanderbilt University. And John, these moments, these kinds of funerals, especially for a former president, are significant. They are a moment for the nation to come together, for former presidents to come together to honor one of their own. Talk us through your expectations and the way you see the next few weeks playing out.
It's a great question. Presidential funerals, occasions of state, as you say, often tell us as much about the person being honored, or often tells us more about us than about the person being honored. I think about President Reagan, who died on the anniversary of D-Day in 2004, an event that 20 years before he is so powerfully captured. And I think President Carter's death, to some extent, without being overly grand about it, marks part of the end of an era. And the era was one in which, for all of our ferocity, for all of the dissensions and disputes of democracy, former presidents, people of both parties, could come together on big things. We haven't mentioned President Carter and the man he beat, Gerald Ford, became quite close, became advocates for election reform after 2000. And you played a moment ago that remarkable scene in Atlanta at the opening of the Carter Center where Ronald Reagan saluted the man that he had defeated that has become ever rarer. And I think President Biden has tried to do all he can to maintain the decorum and dignity of the office. But it's a different time. It's a time when our trust in institutions is ebbing. It's a time, self-evidently, where a dispositive number of American voters chose to have an unconventional figure lead them again in President Trump. And so it will be a kind of a bittersweet moment. I think it'll be a reflective one. I'm sure President Biden will speak from the heart because that is the world from which he comes, a world in which every dispute does not have to be cataclysmic. And so one hopes, and I think President Carter, as a man of faith, would believe this as well, one would hope that these rites, that this commemoration, would do what in religious terms remembrance ideally does, which is not simply lead us to exercise nostalgia, but to remember what is also worth emulating, and to emulate the grace that the Carters brought to the world stage, I think would help us all in this era.
Jon Meacham, we're glad to have you with us tonight.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.